Hi, you're listening to the Full Stack Educator podcast.
We provide relevant resources to new and aspiring independent school leaders to help you grow, succeed at work, and have a positive impact on the lives of students.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Matt.
On this podcast, we have insightful conversations with leaders from across all areas of independent school education.
Hello, Michael.
Matt, how are you doing?
I'm well. We've got some more podcasts ready to go. So we're going to get those out.
Awesome. It's exciting. Some really good conversations.
Yep. And we've started doing something new. Our listeners may have noticed our new format where we talk more at the beginning.
Yes.
So if you are listening and you want to drop us a line, let us know what you think. That would be great. We would love to hear from you. And you know, one thing we haven't done since we've started this new format, we always end our podcasts with 3 questions, and they are: what should people be reading? What should people be listening to? And how do we get in contact with you? And you, of course, know how to get in contact with us because you're listening to our podcast. But I'm curious to know, Michael, what should we be reading and what should we be listening to?
All right. Well, what I can share is what I've been reading and the things that I'd recommend. So I'm currently in the middle of 4 books relevant to this particular podcast. Nice. One is Be the Bridge by Latasha Morrison.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a really good book. It's a book about racial reconciliation from a Christian perspective. And it's amazing. So I've really been enjoying that and would highly recommend it. Another book I'm reading in a similar vein is called The Deeply Formed Life by Rich Villodas. And I picked this one up. You know, I think leaders need to be really conscientious about their emotional and mental health. And so I heard really good things about this book in terms of just leading a more intentionally self-reflective life, especially when it comes to your faith. And so I highly recommend it. And it's a phenomenal read. A book that I got and am excited about starting. I've listened to a few podcasts with the author of this book. The author is Caitlin Scheiss. It's called The Liturgy of Politics. And it's really interesting. It says spiritual formation for the sake of our neighbor, and is sort of the subtitle. And the book is just about, the idea of the political polarization in our world today and what that looks like from, different spiritual perspectives. And the final book that I am almost done with, actually, is I think I've said in a previous podcast that I'm late to the game with Brene Brown. Everybody I know has already read all her stuff, but
I haven't. So you're not
wrong. Her Dare to Lead book was amazing, and someone recommended a previous book of hers called The Gifts of Imperfection, and she just released a 10th year anniversary version of it. And it's incredible. So I highly recommend that book as well. And there's like a test you can take, a self-assessment online before you read it. It's really interesting. So I recommend that book too. What about you, Matt? What should people be reading?
What should people be reading? Well, like you, I'll kind of share what I've read recently. A book that I have been recommending to everybody is Black Klansman. And Spike Lee made a movie out of it, which is good in its own right, but it's very different from the book. It's more of a fictionalized version. But Black Klansman is the true story of a detective in the 1970s, African-American detective who infiltrated the KKK. And at the same time, he is investigating the KKK. He is also tasked with sort of light espionage on the Black Panther Party when they come to his city. And he's even assigned to be David Duke's bodyguard when David Duke comes to visit. I mean, it's just, you can't make this stuff up. And it's not even a particularly well-written memoir. It's just so fascinating. And you get a sense of his integrity and his sense of duty while navigating the absolute most polarized situation you could possibly imagine, and really pretty dangerous at the same time. So I thought it was great. And the movie is in a separate vein, fictionalized, it's also an amazing movie. Great example of Spike Lee's work. So what are you listening to? What should we be listening to?
All right. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. So I had to narrow this down. I listen to podcasts when I'm working out, when I'm like doing chores, whatever. So
Nice.
There's one that I'm really enjoying right now that my wife turned me on to. It's called Pantsuit Politics. And their slogan is nuanced and grace-filled perspectives on politics and the news. And so it's these two lawyers who sit down and just talk about different political ideas from multiple perspectives. And I mean, I'm not saying it's unbiased, but it's really good. I like it.
Yeah.
Throughline by NPR is one I enjoy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they've had some really good episodes recently, but I like Throughline a lot. They take some concept and then sort of trace it throughout history and explain, the origin of it. It's really good. There's a leadership podcast called Lead Stories, and it's two leaders who literally just tell stories about leadership from their experiences. And it's really great. And if you are a leader, hearing people talk about real, actual like leadership stories that are things you've experienced can be very cathartic, especially when they have, when they have thoughtful reflections about those things. One of the most fascinating podcasts I've been listening to recently is called Choiceology. And it's by, I think her name is Katie Milkman. And she's a professor at the Wharton School at UPenn. And the whole podcast is about like the brain science of making choices. Nice. And it's fascinating. It's pretty short. They take some particular idea about, choice making and just break it down. And when I first heard about it, I thought that sounds like it would probably be actually pretty boring, but it's been fascinating. Nice. So I enjoyed that. And I enjoy a podcast called Big Ideas in Education. It's really good. It's three individuals who talk about recent research and recent articles that have come out, or recent events that have occurred that are all related to education within the last week. And the final one is Brene Brown's Dare to Lead podcast. So I finished her book recently, and the podcast just came out, and it's really good. So I highly recommend that. What about you? What are you listening to?
Well, we kind of hit on this in the podcast at the end, but I should listen to more podcasts, but I've been listening to a lot of music. I've been trying to actually stretch myself a little bit more. And I heard a story. I can't confirm that this is true. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper, but it was a story about a jazz pianist called his name was Art Tatum, African-American, like 20s, 30s, early jazz. And the story goes that he's referred to as the man with four hands. And the reason he's called the man with four hands is because he plays so incredibly fast. But he learned to do that because he, as an African-American, wasn't allowed to go into the concert halls. So he would just listen to the broadcast, but he didn't pick up on the fact that it was two people playing the piano on certain pieces called piano four hands. And so he learned to play all four hand parts. I'm not saying that in a way that makes sense. Like he learned to play two people's piano parts himself. And developed his entire style that way. So I heard the story and I'm like, how have I never heard of this guy? And I checked him out. All of his stuff's on Spotify or anywhere else you want to listen to it. And it is astounding. I highly one of my favorite tracks is Body and Soul. It's just gorgeous. I mean, there's parts of it that are just lightning fast, but it's this lilting piece that almost sounds, you can hear like French Impressionism in it. You can hear jazz elements in it. It's just utterly gorgeous. So I've started enjoying some Art Tatum recently. And I've started really enjoying jazz more, which I've always appreciated it, but I've never really enjoyed it. So I've done that. And then I went through a huge Motown phase recently. I think just because like everybody, I needed some pick-me-ups, and nothing puts me in a better mood than Motown does. So I dug a little deeper in Motown too. And if you don't know, I guess they're kind of famous, but if you don't know who they are, you need to to read up on the Funk Brothers. So the Funk Brothers were the studio band basically at Motown Records in the early days. So when you listen to like the Supremes, the Temptations, you name it, that band is all the same 4 or 5 guys playing all of those songs.
Wow.
They totally invented that style. And basically did it on the fly in this basement recording studio. I mean, that's where it came from. Which later went on to influence like the Jackson 5 and whatnot. And they did do some touring on their own and kind of had some notoriety in their own right. But those guys are pretty amazing. And just Motown in general, it's just a wonderful, wonderful part of music history. So that's what I think you should listen to. Art Tatum, jazz, Motown, things like that.
Well, that's great. Well, let's talk about our podcast episode or who we're interviewing for this episode. Today, we had a really great conversation with Dr. Jennifer Stimpson. Dr. Stimpson is a chemist, independent school teacher, and a recent alumni of the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. She was named the If Then Ambassador by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She developed an all-girls initiative focused on leadership skills and academic success. The city of Dallas issued a proclamation lauding her work in developing a sustainable biofuel source for the school district's transportation system. Dr. Stimpson has also been honored by the Oprah Magazine, the state of Texas, U.S. Congress, the Michael Jordan Foundation, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Dallas County Community College District, which recently called her a role model for future STEM teachers, honoring her with an Exemplary Teacher Award. To recognize her efforts in the future of science, Dr. Stimpson's also received the Hidden Figures in STEM Award from the National Society of Black Engineers. So her resume is quite impressive.
Yes, it is.
It's many accolades here. So we had a phenomenal conversation with her, and let's get to it. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for being on our podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
We'd love to start. We ask each of our guests to share their journey within education. And we'd love to start by just asking you, how did you get into education, and how has your path taken you from where you started to where you are now?
This is one of my favorite stories to tell. We all have stories, and this is my favorite one. So my journey to education was very non-traditional and non-trajectory. So my first career, when I graduated from graduate school, I have an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in chemistry. And so my first job out of college, I was a forensic chemist. And I ended up working for the Drug Enforcement Administration. And one of the tasks that we were responsible for as an employee, we had to do some kind of volunteer work 1 hour a week. Didn't matter. We could have picked up trash on the side of the highway. We could have played bingo with the elderly. We could read, have story time with kids at the library. It didn't matter. We just had to perform some kind of volunteer service. And so the agency, or the office where I worked, happened to have had a partnership for 3 years with a local elementary school. And they had not done any work with them in 3 years. And so the secretary was like, "Hey, Jen, why don't you go and be the representative for the school?" And I was like, shrug shoulders. Okay, I'll go. And so when I walked into the school, I was assigned to a 4th grade class, and quickly realizing that these kids had no idea what science was, and they had no idea what a scientist did or who one was. The school did not have a science program because there was no one there to teach it or to explain it. So that was absent from their curricula. Absent in all forms. And so long story short, my 1 hour a week turned into 1 day a week, and then it turned into multiple days a week. As teachers, we all know how connected our students are to us and how important our opinions and our thoughts and our smiles are in their lives. And so they started seeing me as a teacher, and they wanted me to be a participant in all of their activities. Miss Stimpson, can you come on this day? Miss Jen, can you come watch me do this? And what I realized is my 1 day a week became multiple days a week. And I was neglecting my own work as a scientist, as a professional scientist, in the lab. And so let's fast forward. I was doing that for a while, and I was called into my supervisor's office, and he said, Jennifer, I want to let you know that you are being awarded the prestigious Administrator's Award for your community service. So this award, the Administrator's Award, is normally given to an agent because he analyzed he collected a certain type of drug, or it was given to an agent who lost his life in duty, or some kind of recognition. I got mine for community service, not for being a scientist. So as I walked up to receive the award, I recognized that this was a calling I had on my life. I got that award in April, and I was in the classroom in August. And now, 2 decades later, I am proud to say that my teaching career began as a chemist who chose to teach. So I walked away from being a scientist to becoming an educator. So I left the classroom last year, I should say I'm on sabbatical, to become an Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellow. I was selected by the DEA as one of 15 fellows, and we are working in and across DC in the various federal agencies. Some people are at LOC, Library of Congress, some people are at USGS, and some people are in NASA. I happen to be in Congress. And in my role, I offer my science expertise and my teaching lens to help draft legislation to include the importance of science education as we provide, curricula across the United States. So it's been a great experience, though in quarantine. I mean, just the idea of having an impact on how and what students learn at the federal level has just been so enlightening. And I'm just really excited to play a part in that. And who knows, maybe the trajectory of how kids of all backgrounds and in all types of schools learn science will be impacted. So I'm looking forward to seeing what will happen in the years to come. So that's how I became a teacher and now a fellow.
That is really cool. That is a neat, that's a neat sort of introduction to education that you had. So, being a chemist and then, spending time at a school teaching kids, that must have been a really incredible experience for the kids too, having a science teacher who was an active chemist. That's pretty cool.
Right. And understand that where I was teaching was not in a type of school that many kids in independent schools had. I worked at a truly an inner city urban school system. So the idea of a scientist was very foreign. This is before Bill Nye. This is before science was cool. This is before podcasting. So the vocabulary word science or scientist was not something that kids where I worked, where I was volunteering, would have known anything about. They had no concept. You don't have any vocabulary for that which you don't know anything about. So it was great because I was their introduction to science. And so there is that pathway that you've opened the door to the next generation of scientists by literally opening the door because they had no idea that there was a door that needed to be opened. So that there is that piece.
Let's talk about your doctoral studies and your dissertation. You recently completed your doctoral studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And your dissertation research, let's see if we've got this right, focused on changing perspectives around what scientists look like. And specifically, you looked at what we might call the science identity of Black middle school girls at independent schools. Is that right?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Well, tell us about it and what made you choose that topic.
Well, I want to say that the story is very personal to me because I am that student. I grew up, I also had a varied academic journey, coming from pre-K to college. And I did attend an independent school. And so in that space, I was often the only Black girl in many of my classes. And so part of my journey or part of my story was personal. But as a teacher in an independent school, what sparked my interest is that when I taught high school chemistry, I recognized that even though the school did have Black students in it, there were not enough of them, if any, taking any advanced science classes, specifically taking advanced chemistry classes. They may have taken like human geo or things like that, but no advanced chemistry or math classes. And so that was concerning to me. And I did a pilot study, not connected to my dissertation, just to understand the last 3 years of alums at the school where I worked, to find out like what was causing your distance, or why didn't you take these classes? And the studies varied. We were not encouraged. We were told to consider something else, or it just wasn't an interest, or they meaning the school or the teachers, didn't make it interesting. So I found that piece worthy of note, which is why I wanted to know if that was happening when these girls were in high school, what was happening in middle school to stop them when they got to ninth grade. So what was happening? Okay. And so for me, it was really, the other thing is that I got from both the research and from the pilot study is that the girls all resonated in some way, form, or fashion, is that they did not have any role models. And so role models for them meant physical, the phenotype or looking just like them. And I often wondered, like when I was teaching in high school, why this was happening. And there's a need, we all know, that for more African-American females in the STEM fields. And so as this increases, so does that need for exposure, for opportunity, and for stronger education starting in middle school and now even starting in elementary school. And so for me, the study was really about to understand how their science interests might improve as a result of their academic experiences. So this idea of STEM identity, meaning, do you have an interest? Do you want to become a scientist? Or what is stopping you from becoming a scientist? So I set out to understand the science experiences of Black girls at an independent school.
That's great. So let's break down your study a bit, and maybe you can share with us some of the things that you found. It seems like the data for your study came from student and teacher interviews. Is that correct?
Yes. I interviewed both students and teachers. Yes.
Wonderful. So what are some of the highlights? What are some of the major themes that you found during those interviews?
So there were 3 that I'd like to talk about really briefly. And the first one is a lack of cultural representation. And that for what came out of that is that the girls at the school had a low science interest. And that was because they didn't see science matching up with their life or themselves. There was not enough cultural representation. And so I actually have a quote from one of my students. And she said, it's not that they, meaning the school or the teachers, didn't promote that women can be scientists, because I feel like our school is predominantly white, and they didn't really promote non-white people, and that can be an important in scientific roles. And so that really struck with me, because what is often a reality for everyone is when you think of a scientist, you don't think of anyone else but an older white male. That's just the image that society has for science. And this generation of girls that I interviewed grew up on Bill Nye. And so who is Bill Nye? An older white man in a lab coat. And so changing the narrative of who a scientist is and how one can become a scientist. The idea of it, could it be a girl? Could it be a female? Could it be a female of color? All of these ideas and these narratives weren't represented, even though those individuals are out there. And so that was one of the big takeaways, or the one that was one of the themes that kept resounding over and over, is that there are not enough representations of me in the lessons that we teach. Another takeaway was the lack of hands-on activities. Now, if you think about classrooms and think about science, we as science teachers, at least as me as a science teacher, every day we're doing some kind of science experiment. We're doing some kind of science. I'm real big on hands-on activities, because otherwise you're just sitting there lecturing. It's like the Charlie Brown effect. Wah, 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 wah. And the girls in this study said that they don't get enough hands-on experiences. There's still a lot of lecture and not enough doing. And what I found interesting is that in the 8th grade, the students talked about perfecting their note-taking skills. That was the focus of the class. And even though there were science opportunities, the teacher did the demos and the kids took notes about it. And that, was interesting. So there was a lack of hands-on experiences that the girls felt that they did not get enough of. And then the last, big theme that, I want to talk about is that there's a lack of connection to the future of STEM. And these girls have, a disinterest in becoming a scientist because they don't see this idea that it's possible. Because at this age, kids are eating up everything teachers say. You're in middle school, you're evolving your identity of how you want the world to see you. If you want to be an athlete, if you want to be smart, if you want to be a ballerina, how you're forming who you want to become starts in middle school. And the idea of you not seeing yourself in the future disinterests you in moving in that direction. And so another quote that I wanted to share with you is that there were probably a lot of, this is from a student, I'm sorry, there were probably a lot more women in science and women of color in science that we know of, but nobody really likes to talk about that. And they, meaning the teachers, don't want to focus on that. So now we're just left with the ones that they've heard of, and there are not that many that we've not heard of. And in this context, what the student is saying is that the same scientists get recycled in conversation, Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, but not talking about new scientists or talking about the idea that science can be evolved into women that are doing work. I ask about, have you heard about any women in science? And the one that they keep talking about is Marie Curie. And what I also caught from my dad is one girl was very adamant. She was a seventh grader. And she's like, I've been hearing about the same thing since I was in second grade. So are there no new scientists out there? And that means that the curricula or the teachers teaching it haven't made the conscious choice or are unaware that there is an opportunity to make change and actually acting on the idea that there should be a change.
Those are really compelling findings. I'd love to ask some questions about each of those, if that's okay.
Okay, go for it. Yeah.
So the first one that you brought up was a lack of cultural representation in science. And so I'd love to unpack that a little bit, because I think that a popular misconception is that increasing cultural representation in science just means finding textbooks with more diverse looking individuals in them. But it's certainly a lot more than that. So can we talk a little bit about how to frame the idea of cultural representation in curriculum?
Sure. So, when I was doing my work, I looked at the work of intersectionality, because as you know, when you're a grad student, you got to figure out what you want to talk about, and we all come to the table as new doctoral candidates with all these great ideas, but you have to narrow them down. And I realized that I was really looking at this intersection of being a Black girl, being a middle schooler, and being a scientist. So there's like a trifecta or a tri-crossing. And so that intersectionality and framing that is the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. So she talked a lot about intersectionality and really about being Black and being something else, and how that intersectionality is really important. And also the work of Gloria Lasson-Billings in that the cultural relevant pedagogy, and thinking about, like you just asked, just turning into, taking the textbooks and reframing and repurposing who we study. It's deeper than just saying, okay, well, now we're not going to talk about Thomas Edison. We're going to talk about a different scientist. That requires training, and that requires study beyond what you're already doing as a teacher. And different schools, especially different independent schools, run their curricula really differently. So the school where I work, for example, the science department actually writes its own curricula. So we get to decide who we want to talk about, what we want to talk about, and how what is talked about is delivered. So unless we choicefully include diverse voices, then those diverse voices become absent. But if you're a teacher and you've been doing your job for a long time, it becomes habit. And one of the greatest tyrants to break is habit. And so until that change happens, then there isn't going to be a change that happens. And so I became interested in the work of Paulo Freire, and I do not speak Portuguese or French, so I probably blasted his name, but his work on the experiences of the oppressed and how they survive in the world under this notion that you have to learn how to do things this way. And so I asked this question, after, reading my dissertation, after I finished writing it, I started to ask this question about science in general and this cultural relevant pedagogy and in this direction of, is it education or is it indoctrination? Because if we think about education, we are feeding students with information and content. How do you know what you know? Because your teacher tells you. Indoctrination, you must know this, you must know this, you must know this. So they are two verbs, they're connected, but I think on opposite ends of this connection, there's a tug of war. You're indoctrinating the kids with, you must do it this way, versus educating the kids with, you must learn it this way. And so, framing it, we have to define what it is we're framing, the education or the indoctrination.
Oh man, that's a fascinating way to frame that whole discussion, indoctrination versus education. I mean, that seems like that could be a whole podcast episode, Jennifer.
Yes, that's like that's part. Deep. Yeah, seasons. That's the next season. Let's just save that for the next season. The whole podcast.
Well, let's look at your second finding.
Okay.
Regarding opportunities to have more hands-on engagement. You loved what one teacher said, that they were practicing honing their note-taking skills. That's lovely. Being sarcastic. So what you saw classes where they were just watching the teacher do experiments. Right. What else was happening in these classes if they weren't doing hands-on science?
Well, that was it. It was a lot of observation. Okay. A lot of what I also found interesting is that, I should say I find interesting. First of all, let's just be aware that at an independent school, the numbers of Black students is going to be low anyway. So the idea of you having a classroom full of diverse students who happen to be all of one race is probably going to be limited. And definitely, if you're not going to ever have, you wouldn't have all of the Black kids in a grade in one class. It probably wouldn't happen like that. Or if it did happen, it would be a conversation that the students would definitely have, because at this age, they're girls, they talk and they are aware. But many of the classes, there are one or two. And the largest number of Black students I saw in one middle school class was 3. So that just happened to be that case. So couple of takeaways from that. In all of these situations, the Black girls were not sitting together, the ones that had the multiple numbers of kids in class. And you asked, what were they doing? They were watching, unless it had something to do with them actually doing the task at hand. They were participants in the conversation, and over the months that I did the work, when the kids were working, they were working absent from the teacher, meaning that they were working collectively in their groups and such. I did observe in one particular class, I thought it was interesting that, I came across this. So there was one student, an 8th grade student, who the teacher kept calling on, and she was not offering an answer. And her lack of voice, or the fact that she didn't, it had everything to do that she was shy and that she didn't feel confident in her responses. And I thought it was neat that her classmates or the people at her table were encouraging her to say, well, that's not what you said the other night when we were studying together. And that idea of, being vocal in front of a group of people is often something, that you've got to come over. Again, we're talking about middle school girls figuring out what their identity is, when and where to enter and have your voice heard. And so there's a lot of that I recognized.
What are some ways that a class could be better? And it is tricky to, I imagine, as a science teacher in general, to balance, observation to make sure everyone can get their hands in and involved. But what are practical steps that a teacher could take to improve this problem, particularly for Black kids in the class?
Oh, well, one of the things if I could have my way of running things, how I used to run things, where I would invite the kids to offer lesson ideas. Again, because when you're in an independent school, you have a lot of control of the curricula. I would have this, I won't call it a contest, but I would offer an extra credit. So if you want to design a lab experience, you design it, and then I'll implement it. I'll teachify it. So you write it up, in your 5th, 6th, 7th grade, mind, and then I'll make it so that we can actually implement it. And the idea of having your voice heard is that's one way of allowing the kids to have an active role in that. The other thing is that when you're often the only one in class, there are things that you bring with you in that space, because you're not only bringing your race, you're bringing your identity, you're bringing the fact that all eyes are on you, you're bringing in all of these factors that, make you in this space, that make you stand out. You bring your difference to the table and your difference becomes on display. So even before you start to present or be inclusive, you've got to be ready to dismantle all of that to be open enough to have your voice. Because, and you asked, like, what could teachers do? I would recommend that the teachers be intentionally inclusive with students whose voices are absent. But in terms of Black students or Black girls in general, I would make sure that they are active participants in the curricula in terms of how to diversify it. And what I mean by that is just making sure that you're asking questions that they can connect with, or that they are aware of, or that includes what's happening in their neighborhoods or in their communities, if they indeed live in a community or neighborhood that's different from the students that are in the classroom. So I think that voice plays a role in that. And the beautiful part about having and controlling your own curricula is just that you can manage it and change it as it's almost like an evolving document. You can make changes to it as necessary, which I love.
Where else outside of the classroom could hands-on science opportunities be encouraged?
Oh, at that local community programs. I mean, Girl Scouts
great
does like tons of stuff. There are, civic organizations are always doing things. Churches even. I mean, I've seen some like STEM activities that fall under religious perspectives. I mean, that's great. Pop-ups. There's this new thing called SIY, Science Yourself. So you create your own science thing, themed activity. So my friend of mine in Dallas runs a pop-up makerspace. So she popped it up during the pandemic so that kids could still have that hands-on science experience. Because one of the things that was lost immediately following the pandemic was hands-on science. Now, I'm not saying that all schools were able to jump back in and get things going. But there was a large number of schools where that absence of hands-on science was very visible, and how to figure out how to continue that, because you can teach math online. You can teach a foreign language online. You can even teach art and music online. But how do you teach science online where it's not technology or engineering? And what I mean by science, I'm loyal to the S in the word STEM. So how are we teaching the girls about density? Because they can go online and watch a video. How are we teaching them about simple machines? Those kinds of opportunities were missed, and science teachers had to fill in the gap really quickly. And that's a big loss for me as a science teacher that I witnessed, is like, how am I going to keep these kids engaged in doing when we can't do right now? So
yeah, it's very hard to be hands-on through a screen.
It is very hard to be hands-on because you don't have the stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Well, as I'm reflecting on the first two findings that you've shared about so far, it seems to me like they're so deeply connected. Like if we're thinking about intersectionality and identity, viewing oneself as a scientist, and then also the indoctrination versus education idea, in I guess up against the idea of hands-on engagement with science, it seems like so like the example you gave earlier of a teacher standing in front of students, showing them science and asking them to take notes. Thinking of a situation where maybe that teacher is also white, the idea that by removing students from actually doing science in a hands-on way, that is teaching them something about their identity, in a negative way. But then also to have the person who's doing science teaching white scientists and potentially being a white individual themselves, which is more likely at an independent school to occur. it seems like the invisible curriculum there speaks pretty loudly about who we're saying scientists are and aren't. So I'm curious, like as we're thinking about these ideas, what could you share for like a school leader who maybe wants to perform maybe an audit of their science curriculum, thinking about specifically how it empowers students to identify as a scientist and view themselves? What advice would you give them?
Oh, well, first I would ask the folks in my science department, who have we invited in to talk to our students? Because one of the things about being in an independent school is that we have access to a lot of resources, which means we can invite speakers to come in. One of the things I did far too often was have folks come in all the time from all walks of life, all backgrounds, because I wanted to expose the kids to the content, as well as people who have dissenting views or people who they normally would never come in contact with. And so having that opportunity to engage with the kids was also beneficial. Was a win-win for the school, was a win-win for the kids, and win-win for the people coming in. So I would ask, like, look, what are we doing to ensure that we're inviting people to come in? Because if you as a teacher have not invited the outside to come in, I often question that, because yes, we are the expertise, but we don't know everything, or at least I recognize that the man who knows something knows he knows nothing at all. And I always want my kids to leave out of their spaces asking more questions than they started, because if I answer their questions at the end of every class, then I haven't done my job, because they're supposed to be curious, at least as a scientist. Now, I can't speak of what you guys do in AP English, but in science, if you haven't answered all the questions, because there are no everyday answers, because science evolves and there's always a number that comes after the next one in the number pi. So that whole idea is that we've got to ask questions. So I would challenge my department by asking them, are we including outside voices, even outside of the community, not just outside in terms of race? And is my content relevant to what is happening today? Now, mind you, we're in a pandemic, so I get it. So let's just pretend like we're asking this question on March 11th, before the pandemic. And is the content still relevant to what we're doing today? I mean, is measuring the barometric pressure necessary, or is it just a skill that every kid needs to have? So asking the relevancy question also invites different conversations, because then you start thinking about, oh, wow, well, if I teach about the barometric pressure, then we might consider what they're doing in meteorology. Oh, my weather person on my channel, my news happens to be a female. Let me see if I can invite her to come in, or let me watch her news and see if she's saying something that'll be relevant, because then you bring that into the classroom. And the other question I would ask as a leader is, have you guys thought about your curricula and how it might be dismissive of the students in my class? Dismissive could be those people who identify as different. Pick a race, pick an ability. I had a student who did not have a hand. She was born with a defect. So she was right-handed her whole life because she didn't have a left hand. So she was different. So are we looking at science to be all inclusive because we're at an independent school? Are we looking at it from the lens of, is it dismissive because we're not inclusive, because we do have students that have differences? And are we also saying that, what does it mean to be a scientist? Because most independent schools have teachers who aren't often Black, who are not often have diverging views, or if they do, they're not often ones that are going to say anything or do any of that. But whose definition of a scientist are we teaching about in our science class? Because those things will inform the curricula and hold the teachers accountable for teaching. Now, it's going to force them to stretch their learning, but if you're going to be a leader, there's going to be steps that you have to take to stretch your school and stretch your teachers' learning to be inclusive. And again, if I take the word inclusive and don't limit it to race, but inclusive in terms of divergent voices, divergent meaning not necessarily part of the story that's always been told all along. That's what I mean by diverse voices. and inclusivity. So, I think that's where I would start as a school leader.
That's a great framework. I'll make sure to highlight that and put it in the show notes, even bullet pointed out, because I think all of those are really helpful ways to sort of problematize our own practice. Mm-hmm. Something else that I feel like I'm hearing, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I'm hearing as you're talking is that, when you think about science pedagogy, the hands-on element of it does more than just make it more interesting. It almost seems like it has an impact on the identity of the student, believing that they're actually doing science. Is that yes. Something that you found?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. It's something that I found, something that I believe, and something that I know. I used to run a science camp 14 years. And my camp was, at the time when I launched it, it was different. There was nothing out there like it. And what made it different is that it was middle school kids coming to a college chemistry lab for 3 hours on a Saturday. And in that 3 hours, the kids were actually doing hands-on chemistry at a chemistry lab. So what does it show? It shows that there is the potential for you to become this thing. So you are doing it in the space where it's done, and you're using the equipment that professional scientists use. And this could be you, because what set my camp apart is that every kid got a lab coat. And so not only does that say something with your identity, that makes it stands you up in a different way. It positions you to look for excellence in what you're doing. And it positions you for promise, because now I see it, I can become it. And when you are a student who has a difference, and again, if we don't always label race as different and we decide what we want to put in as different, you're the only person who lives south of this street. You're the only person who has two moms and not a dad and a mom. Whatever we want to label as different is what I'm saying in this space. But when you position kids to see themselves as possible, and then their identity becomes that, you've opened up the door to transform transform themselves to look and like themselves in a whole new way. And that's what you're supposed to do. I mean, that's what science is. And that's what learning is overall. It's the evolution of what your knowledge is in practice. Because what I know, I can do. And if I can see it, I can become it. I have a white lab coat on, then I am walking around, and it's not a Halloween costume. It's an identity that I have every Saturday. And so when the program is over, then you're talking about science in a new way, because you're doing it and you can become it. So if you can see it, you can believe it, and you can become it.
That's great. If you can do it, you can become it. I love it. That's great. So the third finding that you mentioned earlier was that students didn't feel like teachers presented enough career opportunities or career pathways within STEM that they could follow one day. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious if you could speak more to that. I'm wondering, like, when a middle schooler, how does that come about in a middle school conversation? When a middle schooler says, like, what jobs could I do with this? What kind of conversations were you having with them that led to this finding?
Well, I actually came across a STEM survey that was previously done in in a research study years ago. And I used some of those questions and then just kind of repurposed them for the independent school world, and asking those questions about, does your teacher talk about scientists? Yes or no? Does your teacher talk about science careers? Does your teacher talk about being a female and scientist? Does your teacher talk about scientists of color? So all of the questions then were aggregated into data points. And then that led me to recognize that there is the absence of these conversations that are happening in the classroom. Think about when your teacher talked about a scientist, and was that scientist a male or female? Was that scientist white, Black, or other, or whatever? And that's when I realized that the kids were not, the data was showing that was absent. And then in the focus groups, the kids were very vocal about the absence of color and how the kids, how they don't see themselves because they're not encouraged to consider it. And And it's the same story. And that was one of the focus groups. The girls were saying it's the same story over and over and over again. I've been at this school since I was in second grade, and they're still talking about the same scientists. Where are the other scientists out there? And it's, the perceptions led to that there's no cultural sensitivity featured in the curriculum, and that led to their disinterest. And how the teachers delivered and their style of delivery decreased their interest. And then the scientists, the school, they also said that the school department, the science department overall does not invite their interest in STEM. They don't talk about it enough. They hear about STEM outside of school and they recognize it's a big deal, but inside of the school, it's not talked about as this thing that you should be and you should become. And if we talk about in general in society about increasing the number of girls in STEM, the idea of that conversation being much more prevalent is absent. And I think that was resonating with the girls, is like, how is it that when I leave the building, I hear girls should be in STEM. There's not enough girls in STEM, but inside of the school, my teachers don't talk about it. So if they don't talk about it, then why should I care about it? And is there any accountability on the teacher's part? And if so, who holds it? Is that society? Is that mom and dad? Is that the head of school? Whose responsibility is it to ensure that the messages of girls in STEM is the thing that should be focused on? And there's no answer right now, right anyway, but those conversations came about really and very vocally through the focus groups.
I would imagine that a science department, or really any department at a school, sitting down and asking whose responsibility is this would be a valuable conversation to have. And a lot would come out of that alone.
Oh, it would. But that, one of the things I love about this pandemic is I look at it as it's the great equalizer. And I say that because every school district is looking for what works. No school has their best practices because some are hybrid, some are in school, but everybody's just going through right now. No one has the best answer. And this pandemic is also the greatest opportunity to recalibrate everything. So how we do school moving forward is this is the best time to figure it out. We have the data. If you wanted to know how many kids, the learning gaps and what was going on with that, we could really talk about, I use this as, the BC AD, you know what BC means, before Christ, and AD is ad hominem, but it's really before Corona and after disease. What are we doing? How are we evolving what science is going to look like once we establish normalcy again? And this is the greatest opportunity, not just for science education, but for all of K-12 education, hell, all of K-20 education, you can bleep that out, all of K-20 education moving forward. Because if we want to take it a step further, college's responsibilities are to prepare students for the workforce. But when you go to college, what you're learning now isn't what you are going to work for. We have people are living to be 100 years old, and they're working actively until they're 80 years old. They're still going to work every day. My grandmother didn't even live to be 80, but I didn't know any 80-year-olds who had real jobs every day driving to work. But we have a 20-year curriculum for a 100-year life. How is that acceptable? And so how are we looking at education moving forward? And independent schools offer resources abound, and this would be a great opportunity to have these conversations with their departments, with their science departments, and say, look, let's revolutionize this. Do you guys want to take a match and start over and burn it down, or do you want to take what we have and scaffold it, or do you want to completely repurpose it and change the narrative, and so we can be change agents to offer equity in STEM? What does that mean? There's a whole lot that can come out of this pandemic, but it's going to take those leaders who are leading for change to make that happen. And so I encourage all of the heads of schools who are listening to this podcast and all the principals to start asking those questions. What is it going to take, and what does that look like? And start, looking for those answers to make your academic experience, make the academic experiences for your kids like revolutionary. I just think it could be done. And revolutionary, not in a negative way, but using that word to add emphasis. What can we do to make the education experiences more efficient for the kind of world that kids will go into when they graduate?
That's a powerful charge for educational leaders. That's fantastic. There's so many individual sentences you just said that kind of blew my mind. The one that's stuck in my head right now is 20 years of education for a 100-year life. I never really thought about it that way. That's a really compelling framework.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I just think about this, what's happening right now and where we can all just change everything. And I'm just ready to be part of the change that is to come and can come and how everybody can be a part of that, especially in their individual schools. And I don't know, that could work. That could work. It's just going to take effort. And how willing and ready are we to put in the work to make that a reality?
Okay, so you interviewed students in middle school, and you also interviewed their teachers.
Yes.
And you found that the curriculum rarely included scientists of color, even though typically independent schools have quite a bit of freedom to design their own curriculum. And you got the impression the teachers never even considered that a scientist could be different than what they already perceived. So how did those interviews go? How did teachers respond to your questions?
All of them, more or less, all of them said the same thing. There were a lot of hesitations. And so all the teachers that I interviewed happened to be white, and they all acknowledged that they didn't know that there's a repository of Black scientists to present. Like, they don't know where to go. Like, who am I going to talk about? And not that they are taking blame or saying that, yeah, it's my bad, I should know better. But it's just, again, the greatest tyrant that we have is habit. We do things the same way, and that works for us. And so we don't talk about Black scientists, then we're not going to talk about them, or Hispanic scientists, or scientists who happen to be Indian American or Native American or Asian American, whatever that is. We don't talk about those because those are not part of the curricula. That has historically not been part of the curricula. And what I recognized is that for them, it was a choice, because you can choose what you want to talk about, how you want to talk about it, and how you choose to deliver it. And I happen to be a Black teacher at an independent school. So I was intentional of including diverse voices, one, because I was diverse, but the idea of making sure that every voice is included, because I know what absence looks like. And I know when you don't include that, what that also feels like. And they didn't recognize the need to diversify, and, were concerned that they couldn't figure out what to do with it. One particular teacher was a little bit uncomfortable because she didn't have strong answers. And so it was I could tell that that my questions were making her uncomfortable. So we stopped our interview, and I changed the direction of the conversation a little bit. And then another teacher was like, I just feel bad because I don't know, and I should know, but I don't know. And until you asked me this question, I didn't think about it as something I should know. Again, habit, not a personal attack, but just a habit. You know what I mean? Like, they were like, whoa, I guess I never thought about it. And we all do that. We all are like, whoa, I never thought about doing it that way. And whatever the context is, this just happened to be my dissertation work, but it could be, anything, and you can put it in any context. We've all been guilty of that. So I was very aware that it was salient to them that this was something that they were blithely unaware that they were doing, but moving forward, they were going to be incredibly conscious of it just by the virtue of being asked it. Now, whether or not they chose to make changes, was different, but just the fact that it's brought to your attention forces you to consider it, because the more you know, the better off you will, maybe your actions will change. Not the better off you'll be, but maybe your actions will change.
Yeah. So what can a teacher do? say they've thought about this, they're listening to this podcast, they can say, oh, wow, I've never thought about that. I need to start including more scientists of color. Where do I go look? How can I make my curriculum more inclusive?
Well, I would start, if you're at I would actually start with local community. Who in your community is doing science that is different than you? But who is that? If you're at most independent schools are in major metropolitan cities or in suburbs, there's a college close by. See who's at the college who's doing that work. Every college has some faculty of color and has graduate students of color. Invite them to be participants in that, in your curricula design, or invite them to be speakers. Also, look for organizations that are intentionally doing STEM diversity work, racial diversity and gender diversity. I happen to be an ambassador for a AAAS If Then ambassador, and the If Then program is an initiative that's designed to increase the awareness of middle school girls about the wonders and possibilities of science by introducing them to different women who are professional scientists who come from a variety of backgrounds and who do a variety of work. What I loved about meeting all of my other sister scientists is that one of the women designed the game Fortnite, and I know you guys know that every kid in the world in the last 2 years has been playing Fortnite. And one of the scientists who was part of that design team of 4 is an If Then ambassador. There's also a soccer player who's one of the ambassadors. There were women who were disabled, but they are NASA scientists. One of them was a NASA scientist. And so the idea of having access to people who look like you in terms of gender and race and ability, that speaks volumes. So there's the organization If Then, that you can start there if you want to have a variety of different voices. So it's not like you have to go far because they're accessible now. And it's just a matter of doing the work to change the curriculum and change what you teach and how you teach it.
So Jennifer, we're going to ask you 3 questions that we ask every guest on the podcast to close out. But beforehand, I know for a fact that we have some listeners from Dallas. Did I read correctly that sort of to honor some of the work that you're doing, I think with the If Then Ambassador program, a life-size 3D statue of you is going to be installed in a park in Dallas. Is that true?
Yeah, that's kind of true. Yeah. So I'll have my own statue. Well, a statue that looks like me, that's in my likeness erected. I'm being really humble about that. But yes, I actually.
Yes. I believe that's the definition of your own statue.
Yes. Yeah. So I'll have a statue. I'll be among the other 125 women who also have their statue. And because I'm in Dallas, awesome. It'll be placed there. And I don't know what to expect because I've never had a statue. So I don't know, I mentioned earlier, you don't know what you don't know. So I don't know what that means. I just know when I see statues, that's just kind of cool.
That is super cool. And so if you're a listener in Dallas and you're walking through a park down there and you see a 3D printed statue, that's Jennifer.
Okay, but all right, wait a minute. What is it printed from? Like, what is the material?
Oh, it's actually it's a 3D printed. It's 3D printed. So it's going to be, the model starts off as a plastic material, and then
okay.
Yeah, so that's where it starts. We haven't gotten the full science behind what the evolved versions will look like, but as of today, they will all be 3D printed and sustained forever. And it's the idea of it being innovative science because it's never been done before. Never been done in 2 ways. One, there are not enough women statues in open spaces in the United States. But 2, the way in which it's artistically designed. So it's that trifecta of intersectionality I talked about: women, science, and art.
That is very cool. Very cool.
Thanks.
Well, congratulations on that as well. That's amazing.
Thank you.
So the last 3 questions that we ask people as they're, as we're closing out are: what should people be reading? What should people be listening to? And how can people connect with you?
Okay. Well, what should people be reading? I think, given the dynamic culture of what's happening, the context in which we're living in today in 2020 and the pandemic, I recently read, there are 3 books that I actually have open right now. And one of them is The Color of Law. We just had a tumultuous election, and how poverty and racism have been impacted by the laws in which people and where people live according to their zip code. So that was really, that's the first book. The next one that I'm reading is a book by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And actually it's anything by him. He's written 3 books. And so anything by Ta-Nehisi Coates would be great. And as I am working in the pandemic and thinking about how to be more effective, because I'm not in the classroom, but when I go back into the classroom, how I can be more effective. And I'm reading a Brené Brown book called Dare to Lead. And in that book, we learn about empathy, because the experiences that people have are not necessarily ours to worry about or to care about, but to empathize with, and knowing how to take those experiences and then and be more effective at helping people grow and learn. And so as a teacher, I mentioned earlier, if my kids don't leave out of there excited to come back to class because they have more questions, then I failed. But I look at myself as a leader, not just in the classroom, but beyond the classroom, because even when I leave the classroom, I'm still a teacher, and that's how I identify, and that's how people identify me. And so I still have a responsibility to lead people to be more knowledgeable about the wonders and possibilities of science, no matter what the environment is. In terms of listening, I don't have any particular podcast that I subscribe to on a regular basis because I'm not an Audible learner. So that kind of bores me. So I don't often tend to do podcasts. If I listen to anything, I listen to my Spotify accounts, but that's music, so that doesn't count. But I want to
hang on. I have a background as a musician, so I would love to know what's on your Spotify account.
Oh gosh. Okay. So it's funny you say that. Oh my God, that's so funny. I am, one of the things that set me apart in my classroom, and the only reason I know this is because the kids told me. That's the only reason. It's the only reason the kids told me. So I put on music in my classroom, right? And I used to say I don't play lyrical music. And so the kids, what that meant, well, one girl said, Ms. Stimpson, you don't listen to lyrical music. What she was just saying is that it's music. It's not singing and such. It's just background music or whatever. And I am intentional about having, different kinds of music, because you have different kinds of tastes. So I've got all kinds of stuff. And on Fridays, we would play lyrical music. So the girls would be all over the Schuyler Sisters or Miley Cyrus and, what girls listen to, right? But I was trying to find my classroom. One of my playlists is Classroom Jams. And, there's Katy Perry, there's Adele. This is Friday, of course.
Yeah, sure.
All the songs from Frozen. But I listened to Tycho. There's a group called Tycho, and I love their background music as that. But yes, we play music, and the kids love it because it just adds a different flair to learning. So they came to class ready to learn because they know that learning was going to be fun.
Nice. Okay, continue on with what Thank you for that little side trail.
Yes, so that's what they're listening to. And so in terms of connecting with me, wow, I have an IG, I have a Twitter, which I don't tweet as often as I should, but I will. But both my IG and my Twitter are the same, and it's a phonetic spelling of my name, and it's JSTEMP Science. Both of them are the same, J Stimp Science. And so Stimp is in a phonetic spelling of the word STEM, and my last name Stimpson. So if you think about it, they both sound the same. They're homonyms. Is that what it is? Yeah, they're homonyms because they sound the same, but they're spelled differently. So J Stimp Science is a play on my last name, J Stimp.
Awesome. Well, we will put links to both your Instagram and Twitter in our show notes. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for being on our podcast today. We really appreciate it. And it has been an absolute joy speaking with you today.
Thank you guys so much. I really enjoyed it as well. And I hope that I've inspired someone to consider science and education in a whole new way.
Thank you for listening to the Full Stack Educator podcast. We hope that today's conversation helped you grow as an independent school leader. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to resources mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate it, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Episodes of this podcast are released bi-weekly. You can follow and engage with Matt McGee and Michael Amusio on LinkedIn.